Okay, what we're going to do now is take a look at type 4 hypersensitivity, the last of the hypersensitivities that we're going to discuss. Now, this, as the name implies here at the top, let me just get my pen here, is referred to as delayed hypersensitivity. The other three previously, to remind you, are the immediate hypersensitivity reactions. And these are thought to possibly be a response to tissue harboring bacteria or parasites. They are certainly initiated by parasites and bacteria that harbor in the skin or make themselves known for long periods of time in the skin, and in other organs as well. For example, Mycobacterium. This response is largely responsible for the defiguring effects of leprosy and also the destruction of lung tissue by tuberculosis. It occurs most commonly with topical agents react with the skin. So this is contact dermatitis, and cosmetics, chemicals, poison oak, poison ivy can all do this. So this type 4 hypersensitivity really does have to do with really the skin, interactions with the skin, their environment. It's a development of there's a development of Th1 cells which secrete cytokines capable of activating and attracting macrophages. Now, the type 4 hypersensitivity reactions don't involve antibodies, as we're going to see. They do involve the cell-mediated immune response, and that's the difference that you're going to see between type 4 and elements of type 1 and type 2 and type 3. Type 1, type 2, and type 3, to a certain extent, all involve antibodies to a certain extent, and so can involve involvement of antibodies in those responses. This one involves the cell-mediated response. So the basic mechanism, when we look at this, is a contact of an antigen. The allergen, in this case, will be the allergen, will contact and bind to the skin cells, and it's going to bind, and when it does, it will form covalent linkages to the skin cells. And what will happen is there are these skin cell antigen processing cells called Langerhans cells. These will move in, and what they'll do is they will recognize and they will start picking up these cells and antigen processing them because they've been labeled with things that have been potentially foreign. And what they end up doing is moving down. They move from the skin areas into the lymphatics, and then from the lymphatics they then will encounter Th1 cells or naive Th0 cells. And what they're going to do is they're going to initiate, as you can see here, there's antigen processing and peptide, and this peptide interaction is going to involve the allergen, in which the peptide can have the allergen on its surface, on it, so it can be then presented to the T cell receptor as you've seen before, CD3, CD4, MHC2 peptide, BC, and CD28. So all the players that we've seen before here, and they're going to form and activate these Th cells, Th1 cells, Th0, and then eventually the Th1 cells. And these are the main players. So everything else we've seen is here, but these Th1 cells in particular then will differentiate and produce more Th1 cells, and they also produce memory cells, Th1 memory cells as well. So they produce more of these cells, have been essentially cloned out, that could recognize, potentially recognize APCs, Langerhans cells, that are presenting with this MHC2 peptide allergen peptide that's being from the from the covalent linkage to the cell. These are going to then move back into the lymphatics, and they will move back in and search out in the tissues for antigen processing cells, these Langerhans cells that are that have put on their surface MHC2 plus the peptide allergen. And in that consequence, what they do when they do that, they seek out they make more of themselves, and that process excuse me, produces cytokines. Those cytokines, those inflammatory cytokines, as we've seen before, will attract macrophages into that area. Macrophages will begin to basically start seeking out and destroying the tissues, those tissues. So there's a response from the cytokines, these inflammatory response, and then an attraction of macrophages in to seek out and destroy these tissues. So you can see here, this is one of the allergens it's a favorite. Well, it's not a favorite allergen. There's no such thing as that. But it's an allergen which is common. Everybody knows, and this is the allergen that is responsible for poison ivy. It's a pentadecacatechol, and it has this. It has two things about it that make it a powerful type 4 allergen. One is it has these hydroxyl groups which will bind to proteins, form covalent linkages with them. They're very potent in their ability to bind to almost any protein. Lots of different proteins can bind to those. And that's why you don't have drugs with this. These catechols will bind and form covalent linkages with them. And it also has this, if you look at this thing, it has a long fatty or long chain, alkyl chain, which allows it to slip through and easily easily get into the skin and stay there for rather long, can stay there for long periods of time. It can be washed off with soap, but its lipophilicity allows it to get in and want to get into the skin and into the cells and the lipid membranes of the cell quite easily, just like any sort of lotion would want to do. And then these catechols will also allow it to bind to cell surfaces. And you can see here this response is the typical response. You get blistering, blistering and effects on the skin that is fairly common. This is a pretty graphic example of it. I do want to point out one thing I forgot to mention here, and that this process down here, right, to get all of this going, takes a lot of time to occur. It can take several, some time, a couple weeks. It could be a couple of weeks, a week to a couple of weeks before that response. Before then, if that allergen is still there, if it's still covalently linked, what will happen is once you get these migrating to the cells, the system has been activated. Then you'll see the response that you get from the macrophage activation and the cytokine release. And so that's why it's called delayed hypersensitivity, because this part here, the part that involves the activation to the Th1 cells, takes some time to do. And it takes a quantity of the allergen to actually do it. But once it's started and once you make these Th1 cells, they're pretty much there for life. So the next time you get in contact with this allergen, you're going to get you will get a much quicker response. But it can be very delayed in its ability to manifest itself. And even later responses, it can take a while because these Th1 cells will go away with time, but they can be reactivated, and so it can take still time to fully develop that allergic response. So that's why it's referred to as delayed. So there are therapeutics based on type 1 hypersensitivity. It's associated with several diseases, as I said before, like tuberculosis, leprosy, and deep fungal infections. All the effects that you see, the tissue damage, the lung damage, results from actually the macrophages and the immune system destroying tissues that have the allergen or express the allergen. There may be some CD8 cells there, but mainly it's these these phagocytic cells, and they just it's basically lose control of their ability to control themselves, and the immune system lose control of that, and then they go and cause major tissue damage. Type 4 is also associated with these allergic reactions to contact antigens like poison ivy and poison oak, like we said. Now you can test for these allergens by a patch kit in common substances. There are a number of drugs that can cause this, that are particularly drugs that are applied to the skin, or drugs that have phenyl groups and amines and things like that. They can be applied in small, very, very tiny doses to the skin in a grid, and those allergens, and then you can determine which of those allergens is responsible for the dermatitis. Its efficacy is pretty good, although you do get about 20% false positives. You can also take desensitization. There is a desensitization that can occur, and this is an oral desensitization in which you basically ingest small amounts of the extract. In this case, it's an extract from poison ivy, and the treatment should be started only when the patient is free of the rash, and it's usually just escalating doses. So you small amounts are given, usually in sort of a pill form, and then you gradually get escalating doses. And what you're doing here is you're building up antibodies. Antibodies can be built up to the allergen with time, and those antibodies can block the effects of the allergen if they're ingested. I think my favorite side effect here is pruritus ani, which is burning sensation in the rectum, which occurs briefly during the first weeks of this kind of strategy, which is not one of the things that might prevent you from wanting to do this unless you really needed to. So this is a short section, and here's a few review questions about type 4 hypersensitivity. You can go ahead and answer those. You can stop now and answer them, and the answers to them are on the next slide. I'm going to wrap up now the hypersensitivity lectures on pointing out some of their effects, with drugs for drug pathologies. So if you want to stop now, do it now, answer the questions, and now I will go on. So basically, hypersensitivity reactions that we've talked about can induce drug immunopathologies. All four types of the hypersensitivity reactions can lead to deleterious effects when a drug is administered. So almost all those, whether it's a lotion, whether it's a drug that's taken IV, a drug that's taken orally, all drugs have the potential of initiating a hypersensitivity reaction, and that hypersensitivity reaction can be quite life-threatening, or it can be mild to manageable. It just depends on the use of the drug, how much of that response that you can put up with that would make the drug still valuable. So if we look at type 1 hypersensitivity reactions, they cause allergic, remember, from allergic anaphylactic reaction that occurs from allergen complexation with sensitized mast cells. So a drug that binds many places on a self-protein is going to become polyvalent. So it can interact with the sensitized mast cell and cause an type 1 allergic response. So that's pretty self-explanatory. But it's going to depend on the population. How many people in the population have proteins that will have this reaction occur. It can be small or it can be very large, depending on the reactivity of the drug with the particular protein. Type 2, the thing you want to remember is type 2 hypersensitivity reactions are kind of specific in that they really lead to loss of blood cells. And those are generally, as we've seen with type 2, those can generally be lost. Those are generally lost by an ADCC reaction, right, in which B cells get activated, produce antibody, and then later APCs can come along, bind to drugs, antibody that binds to drugs, and destroy those red blood cells. Now that's what happens when we've talked about the specific case for Rh factor. But if drugs actually bind to APCs, and if there are reactions that occur in which the drug molecule, in which you're going to get an immune response to the drug bound to the red blood cells, much like an Rh factor, then you're going to get essentially a serum sickness type response. You can also get this, as I'll point out, by complement initiation, right? Because if you have lots of drug on the ABCs and antibodies bind to that drug, then they can initiate complement, right? That would go in and attack the red blood cell. So there's a little crossover here between type 2 and type 3. But type 2, for what you need to know, really involves around the destruction for drugs. That would be the destruction of red blood cells. Now you'll never go in and start looking for the type of hypersensitivity reaction, whether it's type 2 or type 3. But what you'll find, you'll be looking at the types of effects that come from that. And so just to reiterate, B cell, you have APC's antibody, ADCC, can occur, right, and destroy the red blood cells. And you can have, as we've seen with complement initiation can occur where you get antibodies bound. Antibodies can bind to the drug. If lots of drug is on there, then then antibodies can bind there, and you can get initiation of complement, both of which will destroy the red blood cell. Type 3 is generally, when we think about type 3, we generally think of them as complex formation, complement complex formation, in which you get innocent bystander types of reaction in tissues where complex is lodged, like the kidneys, the blood vessels, and the feet, things like that, where you have large complexes in which you get IgG or IgM, in which you have drugs that are polyvalent, or usually it's potentially a biotech-based drug, in which they basically polymerize the antibody because they have, they have two different binding sites, and so as two binding sites where you can get antibody reaction to it. So as a consequence, these will come together, you'll form this complex, and then these tissue spaces, they can be pretty large. These things can precipitate or get trapped in these tissue spaces, and when they do that, they're going to initiate complement because they're going to attack, right? They're going to attack they'll be able to bind to the back of the joining part of the IgM or the Fc regions of the IgG. So that's generally when we talk about type 3, we're talking about a complexation formation and then bystander effects in the tissues, where you get tissue effects on tissues as you get precipitation of these big complexes that are huge. Because each one of these antibodies, right, for IgM is about 1 million Daltons. So these are huge. These can be huge complexes. And then, as we saw before, type 4 hypersensitivity reactions can cause tissues to be labeled, or anything that gets labels to skin can result in a type 4 hypersensitivity reaction, in which you have the Langerhans cells, APCs, activating the Th0 cells, making Th1 cells, giving us Th1 cells, and then this activation of Th1 cells, which takes some time, then allows these cells to move into the skin. And when it moves into the skin, it can then initiate the macrophage activation. And so anything that binds the skin then could be potentially, or gets into the tissues like that, to the skin, the outer tissues, can, type 4, a drug that does that will initiate this response. So all four hypersensitivity reactions have drug pathologies associated with them. I believe Dr. Rimmel is going to talk about a specific time, a specific example of something like that in the case next week. So this should prepare you for that. So for our take-home message then, just to review, 1, allergic and hypersensitivity reactions result from a non-desirable immune response. 2, both CMI and AMI are involved in allergic reactions. 3, complement is an important part of the immune response ability to combat bacterial infections. It's extremely important, complement is. And 4th, hypersensitivity reactions are a major reason for drug-induced pathology, one of the major reasons for drug-induced pathologies. So with that, we will end, and I will end the lectures on hypersensitivity reactions. It's been great talking to you. Wherever I'm talking to you, I have no idea where you listen to these things. So take care, and have a great summer.